I'm recording this Monday evening. It's been about 2 days now since the Golovkin-Danny Jacobs fight. And this is clearly a fight that boxing fans are immensely passionate about. You know, I did a post-fight video and I didn't expect it necessarily to get too many comments. You know, I guess Golovkin versus Jacobs wasn't a fight that was massively on the radar here in the UK outside of the boxing hardcore. But the passion behind some of the comments that have come through are, you know, it's really taken me back. You get the pro-Golovkin crowd who are saying that anyone who scored it to Jacobs needs to have a good hard look at themselves and doesn't know anything about boxing and, you know, needs to look at the punch stats and is a complete moron. And then you've got the pro-Danny Jacobs crowd saying Golovkin's been horribly exposed. You know, Danny Jacobs took him to school. Danny Jacobs won 8 or 9 rounds. You know, and this is a fight that there's hugely strong opinions on both sides. You know, I did a post-fight reaction video, and you can check out that if you want a full analysis. But I edged the fight by 1 point to Danny Jacobs. I thought it was a very close fight. I had Jacobs winning 7 rounds to 5, and with the knockdown in Golovkin's favour, I scored it 114-113. But as I said in my post-fight video, I don't have a problem with scoring a fight 6 rounds each, and therefore edging Golovkin ahead by 1 point based on the knockdown. I thought it was 114-113 either way, you know, in my particular opinion. You know, and I think people who are getting themselves massively upset about, you know, the commentary on this fight, not necessarily my commentary, but yeah, I was listening to The Boxing Voice, who did a podcast on this, and, you know, massive upset from certain corners on that, so about, you know, the scoring and who deserved to win the fight, etc. But I think realistically we've got to accept that this was a very close fight. As I say it, and as I think 90% of the people who watch this say that this is a 114-113 fight either way. We've got to acknowledge that this is a close fight. We've got to acknowledge that boxing is a sport that, like it or not, is scored somewhat subjectively. And, you know, realistically, this was not a fight where your man, whether that's Golovkin or Jacobs, won by a landslide. Yeah, this was a close competitive fight. But anyway, I'm digressing. The reason for this video is, you know, I did my post-fight thoughts and, you know, got a lot of comments and a lot of people sending me follow-up messages. And, you know, one of the key themes that were coming through was, how do I see Golovkin at this stage of his career, about to turn 35 years old, doing against some of the biggest names in boxing? So by that, you know, Canelo Alvarez, how does Golovkin do against Canelo Alvarez? How does Golovkin do up at 168 pounds versus James Degale? And, you know, certainly the British contingent, how does Golovkin do against Eubank Jr? How does Golovkin do against Billy Joe Saunders? So I'm going to start by, you know, necessarily looking at some of those options. But first, let me say, I was always under the impression that if you were to design a fighter to beat Golovkin, it wasn't going to be a runner. It wasn't necessarily going to be a back foot guy. It wasn't necessarily going to be someone who looked to keep distance and, you know, try and box off the back foot. I thought Golovkin was too efficient at cutting down the ring. I thought he was too accurate with his jab. I thought he was too deadly, closing people down and working the body. And I always thought that that sort of back foot defensive style was just of no use against Gennady Golovkin. But Danny Jacobs has now put a severe question in my mind on that, because Jacobs caused Golovkin severe issues. You know, whatever your opinion is of this fight, let's agree that Jacobs took multiple rounds off Gennady Golovkin, seemingly with his tactic being to work the jab off the back foot and keep distance and keep range. So, you know, however you scored this fight, let's agree that Danny Jacobs took multiple rounds off Gennady Golovkin using that tactic and managed to take him to distance. If I'm thinking of fighters who could adopt a similar style to Danny Jacobs, but maybe do it even more effectively than he did, one name that springs out is Erislandy Lara. Now, Lara is a guy who's best known for campaigning at the 154-pound division, and I've never really thought he's big at 154 pounds. I think part of Danny Jacobs' success was the fact not only was he able to adopt that style against Golovkin, but he was also a much bigger guy. I think Danny Jacobs is 6 foot tall. Danny Jacobs is supposedly entered the ring at 180 pounds. So Jacobs had a combination of a size advantage with that style. And I think the size advantage was especially key given the way he chose to operate. Because that length, that reach, really came into its own when you consider the style that he adopted by trying to box and move and work the jab off the back foot. So, Erislandy Lara, could he maybe be more effective on the back foot than Danny Jacobs? Could he maybe be more disciplined? Possibly. Would he be able to have the same success with his lack of size and, one would presume, comparative lack of punching power, given that he's coming from the weight division below? I'm sceptical. I think Golovkin probably is able to walk through his punches, and as a result will give him less respect than he gave Danny Jacobs. Now, Billy Joe Saunders is interesting, and I touched on this in my initial post-fight video, but a lot of the success that Danny Jacobs enjoyed in this fight, I think Billy Joe Saunders would enjoy as well. Danny Jacobs was effective from the southpaw stance. Billy Joe's a southpaw. Danny Jacobs was effective with the jab and changing levels with the jab. Billy Joe's got a very good, quick, snappy jab. Danny Jacobs showed a real advantage in hand speed against Gennady Golovkin. Billy Joe has got really, really good hand speed. Danny Jacobs adjusted the angles really nicely in this fight. I saw him ducking under Golovkin's punches. I saw him pivoting, wheeling, spinning, using the width of the ring against Golovkin on multiple occasions, and working his way out of corners, working his way off the back of the ropes by being slippery. Billy Joe's got all of that in spades. Billy Joe Saunders' strengths would allow him to have certain advantages in that fight. Am I picking Billy Joe Saunders to beat Golovkin? No. Saunders is a small middleweight. Saunders is a light punching middleweight. Saunders is a middleweight who isn't well conditioned and tends to fade in fights. And the combination of those things make me think that he won't have the same success that Danny Jacobs enjoyed. I just think for Danny Jacobs, it was a complex combination of all the factors. The fact that he's got power, the fact that he's big and rangy, the fact that he had those angles and that jab and that style. I think all of those things put together in the melting pot meant that he was effective against Triple G. And I think while Saunders has certain of those attributes in spades, the ones he lacks in terms of size and snap in his work and certainly stamina, it means that I wouldn't pick him in a fight against Golovkin at this stage. If Golovkin were to get old overnight, and if Golovkin were to show signs of fading and show signs that his abilities were waning as he goes into his 35th year, of course Saunders becomes more and more live. But at the minute, no, you'd make Golovkin a substantial favourite in that fight. As for Canelo, Canelo is a guy who's impressed me recently. He has shown that he carries a good level of punching power, but also a real good level of boxing skill. He's got excellent timing, excellent shot selection. He actually is a very, very underrated counter-puncher, Canelo. I'm increasingly in favour of Canelo. But Canelo's a guy who has enjoyed the majority of his success being the bigger guy in the ring. He's a guy who's enjoyed the majority of his success being the bully in there, having a weight and a size advantage over his opponents. And certainly against Triple G, I think it's safe to say he wouldn't enjoy that advantage to the same extent. I doubt he's as tall as Triple G. Now, it may be that come fight night, Canelo would actually rehydrate to more than Triple G, despite the fact that Canelo's been operating at the division below. But nevertheless, I think that Canelo's advantages that he typically enjoys in size would be negated against a middleweight and an established middleweight in Triple G. Canelo has got certain things that mean that he is a live outsider in the fight. He's a good body puncher, which is something that I'd like to see someone utilise more against Triple G. Canelo's got the ability to box from the outside and put punches together from range, and then step into the pocket and, you know, push the pace a bit more on the inside. Fundamentally, I'm probably not picking him against Triple G. The reason being that when Triple G needs to, he's a guy who can adapt his game. And whilst he didn't always necessarily seem the most adaptive, reactive type against Danny Jacobs in that particular fight, stylistically, I think Triple G has the skill set to beat Canelo. Because I don't believe Canelo's footwork and foot speed is as obvious as Danny Jacobs. I don't think his footwork is as slick and as slippery. I don't think his foot speed, certainly on the back foot, would allow him to switch, change angles and wheel around like Danny Jacobs were able to. And for me, Canelo has always been vulnerable to a guy who uses range and uses a jab against him. You know, we saw that against Erislandy Lara, we saw that with Floyd Mayweather, etc. And I think Triple G would adopt similar tactics to what he adopted in the David Lemieux fight, by getting his jab established early and strong. And I suspect he would still have enough to beat Canelo, admittedly in a you know, barn burner of a fight. So, you know, despite the fact that we're seeing all of this negative press about Triple G, I'm still picking him over Lara, Billy Joe Saunders, Canelo Alvarez, etc. Chris Eubank Jr. is a name that a lot of UK fans are extremely excited about. And certainly, I don't think Chris Eubank Jr. would enjoy any of the successes that Danny Jacobs enjoyed. Eubank Jr., he's got a lot to like about him. He's big, he's strong, he's relentless, he's got high punch output. You know, he's a real come forward, aggressive fighter who has superb combination punching ability. But are the technical flaws in his game too substantial against a guy like Golovkin? For me, whenever Chris Eubank Jr. stands at range, he struggles in fights. His jab is inaccurate. His punches are wide and sometimes wild. He leaves his chin up in the air. His hands are down low. He's very easy to catch, and to catch hard and to catch clean. You know, Chris Eubank Jr., it's an open question what happens if Chris Eubank Jr. is able to impose himself on Gennady Golovkin. Jr. is up at 168 pounds now. Golovkin would be a substantially smaller man. And if Eubank Jr. was able to get in Golovkin's engine room and throw 100, 120 punches around with the ferocity and combinations that he likes to employ, you know, you couldn't rule Eubank Jr. out of any fight. But my fear for Eubank Jr. is that Golovkin, with his technical ability and with his judgment of range and angles, would again be able to try and keep this fight long for stretches of the fight. You know, Golovkin is not going to be a guy who's very easy to walk down and position into the ropes like a lot of Junior's opponents have done. You know, Golovkin's a guy with a superb amateur pedigree and technical understanding of the game. And for me, he's going to be most effective when trying to keep Chris Eubank Jr. off him by getting that jab working and peppering him from range. And I believe that the two guys, quite simply, are different levels from range. You know, Golovkin is so much more accurate, so much more defensively aware, and so much more harder hitting as well. Eubank Jr., not a puncher. So, yeah, again, another fight that I'm picking Golovkin over. One guy who I would pick to beat Golovkin at this stage of his career would be James Degale at 168 pounds. And a large amount of that is due to weight class. You know, and we have weight classes for a reason. Typically, the guy in the higher weight class is going to win. But James Degale, for me, is a very interesting fighter. He's a frustrating fighter because you kind of get the impression watching him he's a lot better than the performances he puts on in the ring. But, you know, in terms of judging a fight, you can say that they're only as good as their last fight or their last fights. So James Degale's constant source of dropping out of fights and, you know, forgoing the middle rounds and being low output and, you know, giving his opponents room to get into a fight, you know, would certainly be a concern against a guy like Triple G. Because if Degale decided to spend 3 or 4 rounds in the middle of a fight just sitting on the ropes and allowing Triple G into the fight, you know, Triple G is not the kind of guy you want just to be able to walk you down, close you on the ropes and let fly with his shots. But I do believe that James Degale, with his size advantage and with his ability to move, with his southpaw and really, really awkward, unorthodox angles, I do believe he's the kind of guy who could actually enjoy some similar successes to what Danny Jacobs enjoyed. You know, James Degale's actually got a decent jab, but he doesn't use it. He doesn't commit to it. And that's a constant frustration with James Degale. You know, if Degale was being trained for Golovkin, he'd have to look at that Danny Jacobs fight. He'd have to look at the success Jacobs enjoyed jabbing onto the back foot. And, you know, hopefully he could do a training camp around that and commit to that jab. Because, believe me, James Degale knows how to throw a jab and knows how to throw an effective jab. But time and time again, we see him neglect that in fights. But for me, James Degale is the guy to beat Gennady Golovkin. And that's testament to Gennady Golovkin, by the way. That is absolute testament to him, that the guy I'm saying I'd pick to beat him is widely regarded as the #1 fighter in the division above. But, you know, if we just talk styles, I think James Degale's the kind of awkward fighter who brings so much to the table. He's a switch hitter. He's adept on the back foot. He's a guy who, you know, you'd back to maybe control the pocket on the inside. He's a guy who's throwing those unorthodox southpaw shots that you don't expect and you don't anticipate from range. And whilst Degale maybe isn't the most electric 168-pound puncher in the division, you've got to factor in that Degale's a guy who, you know, has dropped well-known 168-pounders like Andre Durrell. Degale's a guy who's never been stopped at the weight division above. So whilst Golovkin does have power, and whilst Golovkin, you know, clearly is a very, very big hitter, there's no proof that Golovkin's power at 160 is going to have the same effect on the big boys up at 168 pounds. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting fight. And, you know, Golovkin is extremely live in that fight. Because just like the Billy Joe Saunders fight, Degale and Saunders are kind of similar in the way they kind of lag for points to their fights and allow their opponents into the fight. I'm kind of backing James Degale over Billy Joe Saunders because I believe James Degale is possibly a more well-rounded individual, and I believe James Degale, with his size advantage he'd be enjoying over Golovkin, would bring that to the party. But, you know, for me, even after this Danny Jacobs fight, I don't see anyone I necessarily pick to beat Golovkin at 160 pounds. Funnily enough, the guy who I'd probably give the biggest chance of beating Golovkin over 160 pounds would actually be Danny Jacobs in a rematch. Because Jacobs would come into that rematch filled with confidence, knowing that he deserves to be in the ring with Golovkin and knowing that he's of a similar standard. You know, I myself, as I say, scored the fight to Jacobs, so I'd have to seriously consider picking Danny Jacobs in the rematch based on the fact that I believe he was the superior fighter, winning 7 out of 12 rounds in fight 1. Yeah, but a lot of the other guys, just because Golovkin is looking a bit more vulnerable, and just because Golovkin isn't getting any younger, he's not necessarily a guy who's going to fade overnight. You know, Golovkin, he's a big, big puncher, but he's not just a puncher, is he? He's a technician. He's got that immense, immense amateur pedigree. And even though he's got a tendency to be slightly defensively open in fights, a lot of his fights have ended early. A lot of his fights have been dominations. You know, he hasn't really had many gruesome 12-round wars. I know the Jacobs fight was a 12-round, but, you know, it's very few fights where you can think of where Golovkin's been dragged late into a fight and, you know, taken a real hiding. So even though he's 35, it may actually be the case that he doesn't have that many miles on the clock, certainly in the pros. I know he had a huge amount of fights in the amateurs. So, you know, is Golovkin in the autumn of his career? Potentially. We'll have to see. We won't know till we've seen more evidence. He certainly doesn't look the speediest operator in there at this stage of his career, and I do think that's an area that a lot of guys would have advantages in. Billy Joe Saunders, Chris Eubank Jr, Erislandi Lara, you know, I think those guys have a speed advantage in the fight. But what Golovkin brings to the table is a complex cocktail of attributes and experiences. And I still do genuinely believe that at 160 pounds, he's the man. There isn't anyone picking to beat him at 160 pounds. But what that Jacobs fight did show me is that what I had long suspected, and I've said this on the channel for literally years, is that Golovkin wouldn't enjoy the same success at 168 pounds that he enjoyed at 160. I've never picked Golovkin to beat Carl Frost. And I've done videos on this 2-3 years ago. Who'd win Golovkin Frost? Who'd win Golovkin Ward? Who'd win Golovkin Degale? You know, I have never, ever, ever picked Golovkin in one of those matchups because 160 to 168 pounds, you know, if you're someone who's just new to boxing, that doesn't sound like a big gap. But if you're someone who's been following the sport for years, you'll appreciate that at 168 pounds, you've got guys like George Groves, you've got guys like Callum Smith, you've got real big guys who are probably walking around at 14 stone outside of the ring. You've got guys who are 6'2", 6'3". I think Callum Smith's 6'4". You know, these are big tough guys, and you know, just because you're a devastating puncher at 160, you're not a devastating puncher at 168 necessarily. Look, Golovkin's a better fighter than Arthur Abraham, don't get me wrong, but Arthur Abraham was known as a thunderous knockout artist at 160 pounds. He was known as a heavy-handed fighter. Look, he stepped up to 168, suddenly the knockout stopped. You know, is Arthur Abraham a knockout artist at 168 pounds? Didn't Paul Smith go the distance with him? Didn't Martin Murray go the distance with him? You know, these are because it's not quite as easy. Especially if you're a smaller guy like Golovkin. It's not quite as easy to be hitting those bigger guys and dropping them in the same way that he's been doing at 160 pounds. So, in summary, does this fight expose Golovkin? It depends what you define as exposed. You know, is GGG human? Yes. Is he beatable? Yes. Is he the second coming of Marvin Hagler? No. But is he still the #1 middleweight in the sport for my money? Based on the fact that he got the win, based on the fact that the 3 judges made him victorious over Danny Jacobs, I have to say so. I'd like to see a rematch. In my mind, it was a controversial decision. I'd like to see a rematch. And Danny Jacobs, with the style he'd implement, is actually the middleweight I'd give the best chance of beating Triple G in a rematch. But am I necessarily sitting back and thinking, right, Billy Joe Saunders, Chris Eubank Jr, get Golovkin now? I'm actually not. I'm thinking, let's leave it another year. Let's wait till he's 36, and then let's see how beatable he is. I doubt Triple G ever steps up to 168. I think he knows that he's best served fighting at 160. But if he does, you know, I suspect that Triple G doesn't retire undefeated. Let me know your thoughts. I'd like your comments in the section below. Who are you picking to beat Triple G at this stage of his career? Where do you rate Triple G in the context of world boxing superstars at present? Let me know your thoughts, people. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's been a bit of a longer one, but you know, lots of interesting fantasy-style matchups to discuss given the recent boxing. So leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed the video, please take the time to click the thumbs up button. It helps me get more visibility. If you're new to the channel, or if you haven't done it before, do take the time to subscribe so you can check out all my other stuff. As always, appreciate you guys tuning into my content.